Business AI.
The report says take-up of the technology across England and Wales is incredibly high, with around half of lawyers surveyed reporting they are already using AI technology.
People just don't realise there's an entire new world emerging full of clever new tech that's going to revolutionise the way we do business. The role of the lawyer in particular is changing dramatically.
In total, 126 tech startups have raised venture capital funding in Ukraine since the start of last year, according to PitchBook.
I think lawyers, old school lawyers particularly, think that everything that they do is really, really special and so therefore needs to be bespoke and needs to be done manually in a very artisanal way.
Great legal tech won't replace a great lawyer, but great legal tech in the hands of a great lawyer is game-changing.
This is Legal Disruptors, powered by Summize. Digital contracting done differently.
Hello and welcome back to the Summize Legal Disruptors podcast. I'm Tom Dunlop, the CEO and founder of Summize, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Jonathan Keane, who's the Director of Legal at Figma. So having started his career in private practice before making the move in-house for several US-based tech companies, Jonathan was the first non-US legal professional in several organizations and helped enable companies' rapid growth into Europe and beyond, growing that team around him. So in this episode, we're going to discuss the growing in-house legal teams within fast growth tech companies, the challenges that come with that, and also automation and how and why you'd work with a CLM solution, and in particular automating the lower value tasks. So Jonathan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Tom. Really pleased to be here.
So obviously I just gave a very high level introduction, which was maybe slightly inaccurate, but I will allow you to kind of elaborate a little bit more. How did you get to where you are today? Just a bit more flavor about your background.
Yeah, sure. So it was very accurate, but I'll give you a bit more color. So I followed, I guess, a pretty traditional way into law. Did history as an undergrad because I fancied 2 years at law school to postpone the journey into work. And then, yeah, I trained in the city and kind of worked in M&A and restructuring. Restructuring was a big thing when I qualified back in late 2011. So spent a lot of my time doing that, working on fun projects like Lehman Brothers, etc. But yeah, I kind of in the private practice world was a great learning environment, but I knew pretty early on that it wasn't the long-term career route that I wanted to follow. But fortunately, some of the clients I'd worked with had portfolios with lots of exciting tech companies in, and I managed to get my first gig working for a very small software company in the UK, and went from there.
Nice.
So yeah.
And you're currently at Figma, which probably like many other businesses, we use Figma in our development team, and it's obviously a huge brand and a very public exit to Adobe as well. So I guess the last 2-3 years, I imagine they've been a little bit of a blur, but try and describe a little bit more about how your role's expanded, how the team's expanded, kind of what's been happening around you for the past kind of few years.
Yeah, it's great that you know and like the product, and that's probably the first time in my career that I've been at a company where the name is so well known and the brand has got such amount of love out there. So previously I'd worked for kind of deeper tech companies where they're very successful and very big user base, but kind of no one had heard of you. So that's been quite unique in itself, like having to like speaking with people and having them know the brand and kind of reading about it in the media, etc. So that's a first for me. So yeah, like you said, I joined about 2.5 years ago now as their first non-US counsel, and based in the London office, and it's been a whirlwind, to be honest. It's yeah, when you talk about hypergrowth, there are pressures and there are speeds of development that would normally take other companies 5 to 6 years, which you're doing in 6 months. And so that brings with it its own challenges, but it means you need to be ultra efficient in your processes as well. And you have to brutally triage any work that comes across your desk in legal as well. So we have kind of like this hazing period of 6 months, your first 6 months in seats outside the US, and everyone had to do it in every different function. So marketing, sales, sales ops, the HR, people team. You are on your own and you are running the entire function outside the US for 6 months on your own. And it's a great test, because if you can get through that, then you can survive anything. And then you kind of almost proved yourself, you get the budget to start expanding your team, and that's what's happened here at Figma. So I went from being solo for the first 6 to 9 months here to now being a team of 4 international lawyers kind of underneath me, covering APAC and EMEA. So pretty big time zone.
Nice. And just talking about that expansion, because I think this is a lot of companies that we work with, and will probably listen to this podcast, maybe in that kind of tech world where they're essentially moving as a business. You've almost got to foresee what's going to happen in the next 6, 12, 24 months. Did you have any particular, not necessarily metrics, that allowed you to go to the business and proactively say, I need a lawyer now in advance of 6 months' time? Or was it the business that came to you and said, okay, here's some budget, you can go and get another head? How did you drive that conversation around expanding that team out?
I think I realized within week 1 that I needed another head. So it was a case of persistence, and they're backing it up with metrics. And it's interesting. So there's no magic formula for legal budget building or metrics, and you can look at kind of revenue ratios, or kind of commercial lawyers to salespeople ratios as well. We looked at a bit of both of those, and we looked at the deal cycle as well. I think that's an important one, because deal cycles outside the US tend to be a little longer, just because regulatory concerns in Europe with GDPR and data protection are such a huge issue for a lot of customers in a way that the US previously wasn't, but that is also catching up with CCPA. So looking at deal cycles, looking at how many turns of the documents we were doing, and seeing how many man hours were being put into those, into closing those deals. Those were the kind of metrics we looked at, but it was fairly clear, given the pace of growth of the business, that we would need another commercial lawyer in pretty quickly.
Yeah. That's usually the thing that happens. The first comment when you move in house to a new role is, we need more people straight away. And
I think revenue is like oxygen when you're kind of at the scale up stage as well. So it's like, where can you add the most value and most impact as quickly as possible? And that is closing new business in a way that appropriately manages legal risk and is compliant with local laws. So that's where I think it's best to focus your energies in the first 6 months in seat, and then you can start building up more resources to focus on other elements.
And on that, because I think it's an interesting point that you raised there about the more regulatory piece. One thing that I found, certainly working for a US business before, is that they perhaps didn't have that, not necessarily knowledge as in they're aware of GDPR, but in terms of how that affects the deal cycle, in terms of how important it is for certain customers in EMEA, for example. Did you find that you had to educate the business a little more about not only why the deal cycles are longer, but the importance of that specific part of the deal cycle? Or were they already very aware of it and up to speed?
Yeah, we've got some very knowledgeable lawyers in the US who were definitely aware of it. But I think just emphasizing to the go-to-market business as well, kind of from a sales perspective, you need to build in more time to your forecasting, because these deals are going to take longer on the legal and compliance side. That was where the education came in. And the way I explained it is that we're basically doing 2 negotiations in one. We're doing the MSA, the SSA, whatever we want to call it, the main commercial contract we have with the customer. But then you're negotiating the DPA and any ancillary docs that they might have if they're in finance or a regulated sector as well. So sometimes you're negotiating 2 or 3 different documents for one deal, whereas in the US, that's more likely to be 1, maybe 2 occasionally. So it's a greater volume, and with that volume comes kind of greater time to get those into an acceptable place for both parties. It was more education on the practicalities. Like, we have these kind of higher data protection regulations and laws, what does that mean in terms of a business impact?
No, definitely. Interesting. And I guess coming back to it again, we'll touch on this quite a lot, this kind of US and international or EMEA link. Culturally, how did you find, I mean, you described it quite well before about the kind of 6 months hazing period where you essentially left on your own. How did you manage that? And when you started to bring people into your team, was there a very clear Figma culture that you adopted, or did you almost create your own micro culture in legal that when you started to expand the team, how did that kind of play out?
Yes, it's a great question, and Figma has got the best workplace culture of any company I've ever worked, and I think how is that reflected in legal? I'm very lucky that the general counsel here, a guy called Brendan Mulligan, who I work very closely with, took a kind of an approach of hire good people and get out of the way, which is kind of a very tech focused approach, because simply you don't have the time and resource to be micromanaging people in your team, particularly in legal. And that's something that I've tried to follow through with my team as well. But what I really loved is this idea of building communities. So that's like our foundational company value here at Figma, because we were a community. We were a community growth-led company. So we didn't have a sales team for the first few years of our existence. We simply had a product which the design community loved and almost did our own marketing for us because of the positivity around the product. So it's kind of a product-led, community-led business rather than a purely sales-led business. And I think that element of community is definitely something that we see internally as well between the different teams. And I've never seen such kind of open collaboration between legal and marketing and sales and the people teams as I do here. It's like whatever the opposite of a silo is, that is Figma. And
I think one thing that's interesting with a more software tech business is one thing I found is you have a very broad range of personalities in the same business. So you mentioned it there where you've got often quite big sales team. I think in tech sales in particular, it's a certain personality. And then you've got obviously the design team, you've got a dev team that's a very different personality. From a legal perspective, when you're coming in there and you're trying to, you're building your own, I guess, micro culture almost, like community culture within legal and with these other teams, did you change how legal interacted with depending on the team you were interacting with, or how did you interact with dev, for example, or the more technical folk compared to sales? And was there any kind of nuances in how legal approached your relationship with them?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you do you do consciously and unconsciously in those different contexts. And so something I did with the sales team, for example, is that I really wanted them to feel enabled and empowered to almost become mini lawyers. And the way you can do that is by building like pre-approved gives into the contract negotiations. I wanted to bring them along on the journey and to understand why we negotiate these terms, understand some of the risk involved, so that they don't see legal as a blocker or just another process in the journey to getting it signed. We want to be seen as a vehicle to, like a closing machine, basically, to help sales hit their number. So by empowering them with pre-approved gives that they can offer up on their own without coming back to me or my team, I think that, there comes responsibility with that as well. So that kind of self-serve culture is something I felt was really important. Also, I wanted to recognize sales reps who interacted really well and efficiently and shown best practice with legal. So we brought in quarterly awards for some of the reps if we closed a particularly difficult deal, or they'd been worked particularly well with us on a certain topic, or dealt with a more difficult situation particularly well. And we give those out alongside our cultural awards, and they become a bit of a thing here at Figma as well. So kind of incentivizing in sales to enjoy that interaction with legal and not see it as just a formality they've got to go through. I
love that. I feel like that's a great way of really playing to probably what they really care about. And it's an interesting point about the enablement of sales and allowing them to negotiate. I think it's one thing I found that actually, if you think about what their biggest skill set is as a salesperson, they're probably better negotiators than legal. So actually, the irony is if you do empower them and actually give them, but you're measuring them and making sure they're not just going to that position straight away, they can actually be better negotiators and better outcomes ultimately for the business, ironically.
Yeah, 100%. That's like, so there are so many talents and skills that sales reps have, and it's just unlocking those, because in the non-traditional, just people think selling, pushing the sale through. But yeah, like some of the best negotiators have been some of our reps, and just giving them the knowledge and enabling them to use that to help me is such a big win. But you kind of have to overcome this loyaliness and kind of old-fashioned approach to like knowledge sharing, and like, well, I'm the lawyer, therefore only I can negotiate on these points. Like, provided it's within like a window of acceptable outcomes, then I think we should be doing this with as many different teams across the business as possible, because there's no magic there, as long as you're a good communicator and you can break down what this means to the business, and when it's appropriate to give and not, then, and give guardrails, then yeah, like you said, they can often do the job better than we can ourselves.
And a bit of a question, a tangent to that, which is I think you mentioned it there about it eases the workload for yourself and I guess the stress in yourself. Just a personal one, I guess, for you. You've been through a journey over the last 2.5 years, growing the team and being in a fast growth company like Figma. Well, a lot of people in legal talk about just burnouts and talk about, I guess, falling out of love with being a lawyer and things like that. How do you just personally, I'm curious, avoid that kind of burnout? How did you, I guess, manage this last 2.5 years with the kind of growth journey and sale, and not yourself to a point where you're a crumbling mess on the floor? Or maybe you are, I don't know.
Yeah, not yet, although there's been points. Yeah, I've got close. I think genuinely loving your job, and that sounds very corny, but coming from private practice, where I also work really hard, right, for big US law firms with huge billable hour targets, where I was probably a lot more stressed in that environment than I am working for tech, because the recognition you get on a daily basis for your work is a different level. So you feel hugely valued for the work you're contributing to the business, which is huge. So like this Slack culture, we have a praise culture, channels in Slack, so just giving people virtual high fives in front of the rest of the business. It's great for culture, and it's great for morale, and you really feel that whatever you do has an impact the business. So that's one element to why I actually don't mind putting in these kind of this extra effort, because it's not your average 9 to 5. It's you like I said, the pace of growth is phenomenal, and that brings with itself like challenges, and there are compromises that you have to make, but knowing that is valued and appreciated is huge. Secondly, like, no 2 weeks, I won't say 2 days, because 2 days can be similar, but no 2 weeks are the same. You never know what you're going to be dealing with. And now that I've had APAC added to my scope, that's bringing a whole raft of new challenges, and I get massively energized by interacting with new members of the team in those regions, learning about local cultures, learning about local go-to-market strategy, why we might need to do something differently in India to the rest of South Asia, and looking at like indirect sales models, for example. So that's hugely interesting, and it means I'm constantly using different parts of my brain and constantly learning myself. So although it is very hectic at times, particularly end of quarter, and it can feel like there's a million things going on, I am one of those people who likes like that diversity of work, and kind of makes it feel like you're not doing the same thing. And when something's new and fresh, it doesn't feel quite as challenging as doing the same thing over and over again. In terms of what I do personally, trying to resurrect my rugby career recently, and trying to get out and play as much golf as I can, and spend a lot of time obviously doing childcare. I have an ace and a 5-year-old, and they take up a lot of my spare time. So they are high needs but high reward activities. So yeah.
I know that feeling. I've got an 8-year-old, a 4-year-old, and then I've just added a third who's 4 weeks old to the mix, which is a fun addition to the chaos.
It's surprisingly good nick for someone who's got a 4-week-old. So there's the sleeping going okay.
Thank you. Yes, it's probably the camera rather than how I feel inside. So if we touch on, I guess, turning to tech automation and a side tangent there. So what was I guess in a company like Figma, in some ways you're encouraged for automation, but was there a particular catalyst internally or in your mindset that made you want to procure technology? Was it instantly CLM, or what was the kind of challenge or problem blocker that you immediately realized and thought, I have to get some kind of automation or technology into the business?
Yeah. So CLM is a P0, I think, for any emerging technology company. Simply because if you're growing and you want to be growing, then you're going to have contracts coming in from day one, and it's better to start things off by having a proper CLM in place rather than kind of using Dropbox or whatever kind of workarounds that people usually do when you're in early stage growth, because it's a bigger job migrating everything over into a CLM later on than it is getting one in place from the start. In terms of like justifying the value for that, I think, deal cycles again. How quickly can we get stuff in and closed? How quickly can we automate our contract and order processes so that we are getting our terms in front of customers in a clear and scalable way? And then like looking at the metadata as well. So having a decent CLM that gives you data on turnaround times, on which clauses are most kind of heavily negotiated. That's critical for building out the playbook for me on the legal side, because then we can look at whether we're taking the right positions on those clauses, or are we sitting outside the market norms, and could we do something about that? So absolute priority, and I think that's increasingly the case across most in-house teams now.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. Particularly we've found from the US side of it, it's certainly pretty much everyone has this in active product. It's become an expectation that you will have tech in legal. I think catching up more in EMEA. One thing you touched on there, which looking to elaborate on a little bit further, was the sort of goals and objectives you're looking to achieve. I guess it's different depending on the company, but were you, and I guess you've already alluded to it to an extent, but when you were kind of looking at what you wanted to achieve with a CLM, there's obviously just we need this because we're growing exponentially. Was it more looking forward and saying, if we're going to handle this growth, we need something now because we won't be able to in the future? Or was it, we want to be more efficient than we are now? So we're currently doing it with a 3-day turnaround, for example. We want to make that 2 days. Where was your primary sort of goal or objectives? Was it dealing with it here and now or getting ahead of the growth?
I think a bit of both, to be honest, but definitely forward looking as well. And we are a really data-driven business. If you want to go and get something changed, or you want to introduce something new here at Figma, you better come supported with a lot of data, because that's how we make our product development decisions. It's how we make our go-to-market decisions from a sales and marketing perspective as well. So I don't see why legal should be any different, but legal metrics are harder to traditionally have been quite hard to track and to kind of package up, and the CLM allows you to do that. You can go to our CFO, for example, and say, look, how many contracts we're processing. This is the turnaround time. These are how many attorneys I've got in my team, and this is the ratio of DPAs to SSAs. This is the type of contract they're working on. This is the time they're spending on vendor agreements. If you see like these vendors are particularly troublesome or time consuming because we're spending 17 rounds of negotiation. So it just opens up a whole new world of data that you can then, if you have the time, look through and kind of build efficiencies off the back of that, but also demonstrate your value to the rest of the business.
And an interesting dynamic there you've talked about with the CFO relationship. How important is it for anyone in legal, I guess, certainly from a GC level, head of legal, to talk numbers, to talk finance, to talk forecasts and growth? Because is something that I think is sometimes missed with legal when they talk about what they're doing, very sort of focused on legal work and not necessarily relating that to maybe the wider business. Did you find that certainly in a business like Figma, which I imagine is very, programmatic in how it's growing and in terms of the growth rate and how it's going to be expanded over new regions, like how important is it for legal to really understand that business model and the go-to-market, metrics, things like that to justify things like CLM and spend?
Yeah, it's essential. And I think the most practical example of that is the interactions we have on forecasting calls. So I will join towards the end of the quarter, I will join kind of the weekly forecast calls with the senior sales leadership and occasionally our senior finance leadership as well. And having an insight into what we've called our commit and where we're tracking towards that's an important consideration for us as well in our legal negotiations, because we're not living in a zero-sum game here. Like there's stuff it's not like we say no to a deal and then like there's no consequences. So I guess what I'm trying to say is like risk is not binary. There's risk by not doing things. There's risk by not closing deals, as well as by accepting kind of terms that maybe aren't your optimal positions, but are acceptable within the risk parameters at the time. So everything, you can't understand the wider context of the business without having a really strong relationship with the finance leadership and with the sales leadership. Everything builds on another layer within the business. So the commit builds into our financial forecast for the following year. Like we get ROI metrics off the back of that as well. And then kind of all of our planning for the next year will be based on kind of all of that stuff. So if you want to have a seat at the table, it's a prerequisite that you've got these relationships and that you can understand the language that is being spoken.
Yeah, I think I completely echo that. I think it's a massively missed bit of training experience, exposure for GCs, heads of legal. That's kind of a bit of a hidden art, but if you can crack it, that's how you get the seat at the table. I think it's a really valuable point to take away.
They are as they are ultimately, and if you're you've got to balance taking that now, and as long as you've got some kind of get out, or you're not tying yourself in for a longer term, you've got to constantly balance that short term versus long term needs of the business. And in technology, we're working in normally quite a short term in terms of revenue targets. Everyone is kind of so quarterly driven, and those quarters are so important in terms of kind of broadcasting your performance to the wider market that you can sometimes get trapped into thinking it's okay, we can fix it, like we can push it back into next year, but there is no kind of tomorrow in a lot of these scenarios.
I guess from looking forward, you're clearly at the forefront of one of the leading technology businesses in terms of yourself and how you've established legal teams. Obviously, very forward thinking and probably ahead of a lot of the different legal teams out there. If you were to look forward over the next few years, and we'll try not to say Gen AI in this answer in some way, but what do you think legal teams should be thinking about? How should they be thinking about how the legal team works, functions, focus areas, how they interact with the business? Is there any particular insights that you can share about looking forward over the next few years?
Yeah, I think understanding the underlying technology, if you're in technology, is almost as important as your legal skills, because you've got to understand how the product works, because you don't understand the risk if you don't understand how the product works. So I think technical training for lawyers and getting tech savvy is going to be an essential. And then there's a human element. I think just making work as fun and enjoyable place to be as possible for your team, and really treating management as something on its own, as a skill set, as a muscle that needs to be built, and personal management as well as the technical elements to our job. I don't think lawyers have traditionally been very good at that part of their job, but that's where we can learn from other teams on this. And that's, for example, like getting team offsites, getting us all together to spend 3 or 4 days just focusing on ourselves and our personal development, looking at kind of, there's something called the Clifton Strengths Finder, which I find a fantastic tool, which is like a strengths mapping algorithm that will show you your strengths, and then you can match them up across team members to see where we've got good coverage and where we might need to pay a bit more attention. So yeah, really taking a more forward-looking approach to the welfare and the professional development of each lawyer, because if you're a good boss as an in-house or even in private practice, you kind of want to be developing your team until they're at the point where they want to go away and do your job or do something else where they're stepping up. So that's what I see myself as. And I think there's been too much protectionism over people's roles and the work they take within in-house teams and private practice. And whereas we want to be sharing, we want to be teaching, we want to be enabling, and you want to make someone able to do your role ultimately if you're doing your job right as a manager and a supervisor.
And I have to ask, if you making legal fun was something you talked about, making it fun, how do you do that?
Yeah. So like I touched on it earlier, but the awards we give to the sales team are actually called the Legal Beagle Awards, and they've become a bit of a thing. So Beagle themed gifts. There's an amazing amount of Beagle merchandise out there, thanks to Amazon and other online marketplaces. You get a paraphernalia of Beagle themed mugs, chopping boards. Actually, that's my favorite one. Nice. So yeah, and creating kind of this hall of fame of people who legal have enjoyed working with during their time here at Figma. So that is that's one part of it, but that's more cross-functional. In terms of my team, FaceTime is so important. I think like it's so easy to defer to Zoom or Teams, but there's nothing quite like having everyone in the same location for a couple of days, and it's those informal conversations you end up having. It's the dinners, it's the lunches, that you really get to know people and you really get to build that team spirit. And we were lucky enough to have that last week. I just hired a lawyer in Singapore, and he was over in London for the launch of our new London office. And for the first time, we had the entire international legal team in one space. And I think the value you get out of that has been enormous. And now, rather than just being someone who's sitting over there in APAC, he now very much feels part of the team. And there's a closeness there that probably wouldn't have come about if you'd have been on Zoom calls for 2 or 3 years. So in person definitely has a very strong in-person events, in-person meetings, just being in the same location, even if you're not working together the entire time, it's really important.
No, definitely really good advice. So I guess final question, talks about the team and talks about, I guess, legal more generally. For you individually, I guess if your GC adopts the same mindset, you come in for his job. So what's next for you?
At the moment I'm very kind of happy here at Figma, but there'll be an interesting career crossroads, I'm sure, at some point in the future. I want to stay in tech. I love SaaS. I love the tech community, and I just love the way that they look at problems and challenge the status quo, look at new ways of doing things, and are open to new methods, and reinventing the legal department to fit and to kind of share the same mindset. That's what I really love about my job. It's an interesting question. It's like, a lot of the companies I've worked for have been US based as well. So typically you want your C-suite around your GC to be based with the C-suite. So they've got that in-person access that I just mentioned. But then we've got some superstar kind of technology companies coming up in Europe as well. So I guess the answer is I don't know. I've loved building out international legal teams. But yeah, definitely wouldn't write off being kind of leading from the very top one of these days. But I think just Figma's got such a such a big presence already, and we're growing at such unprecedented rates that I've got enough on my plate for the time being without thinking too far ahead.
Absolutely. Very, very diplomatic answer. No, it's good. It's a good answer. And maybe a tech founder one day. Who knows by the sounds of it?
Yeah, who knows? I'd like to get into venture capital or kind of get more involved in the VC scene as well, because then they can plug you into the next up and coming company within their portfolio, and then you get to assist a wider range of companies as well. So who knows? I think there'll be a lot of fluidity between in-house and VC worlds going forward. So
interesting. Yeah. Perfect. Well, look, thank you so much for your time and sharing those insights. It's been a really interesting conversation. So thank you very much.
Yeah, no worries at all. Absolute pleasure.